So we begin then this evening our study of the book of Haggai. Turn then to the book of Haggai. Again, a short book. We have just a couple chapters. But let's discuss a little bit the background. Let's begin by reading the first two verses, the little book of Haggai. Let me get there myself. Okay. Now there's some background that I hope we can think about before we get into the book. But let's read the first couple of verses. Haggai chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Who'd like to read it for us, please? Haggai 1, verse 1 and 2. Who'd like to read it for us, please? Rick, please.
In the second year of King Darius, in the 6th month, on the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet to Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, saying, Thus speaks the Lord of hosts, saying, This people says the time has not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built.
Okay. So several questions that I'd like for us to discuss on the background, first of all, before we begin. And the first one, of course, is who's the author? Who wrote the book? And the answer, of course, is Haggai. What do you know about Haggai? Question number one. What do you know about Haggai?
He's a prophet.
He's a prophet. And you notice his claim of inspiration right away, just like so many of the prophets did. Verse 2, Thus speaks the Lord, saying. Okay, here's a man claiming to be a prophet. He has a message from God. Okay, what else do you know about him? Anything else? Susie?
I think that's about it.
Okay. And so we know then, it tells us then something, though, about when he prophesied. Question number 2, the background. When did he prophesy? What do we know about his background and when it happened and so on? Aaron.
The second year of King Darius.
Second year of King Darius. Now, who is Darius? Or maybe to ask the question another way, he was a king of who? Susie? Persia. Did you observe it's the time related to a Persian king? Why not a time related to the king of Judah, king of Israel, like other prophets? Susie?
Well, they'd already been in captivity for 70 years. Persia had overcome Babylon, and Cyrus had decreed that the Jews, the captives, could return to Judea.
Which meant there was no king in Judah. There was no king of Israel. The time that we're looking at, the Persian Empire, is after the Babylonian Empire, which means it's after the people of Israel, they were taken captive. Remember our discussion, they went into captivity to Assyria. The southern nation, Judah, went into captivity to Babylon. This tells us more about when we are in history. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. We're in what we ought sometimes call the period of return from captivity. So things have changed in the situations of the nations, and we'll talk more about it as we go along. Okay, so question 3 then, what else do you know about the historical background of the nation, the situation at the time? We've said, okay, they're returning. This is the period when they could return from captivity. Anything else to discuss about the background of the historically? Anybody? Karen?
Well, it's evidently 16 years after the time of Ezra when they had begun to restore the temple. So it's been quite a while.
Okay, so we're going to see as we get into the book that they're supposed to be restoring the temple, so some of them have returned from captivity. but they're not doing it, which is the problem, which we'll talk about. So let's give some more of the background then. Here's a little bit about the Persian kings, at least some of the main ones that relate to the Bible story. And by the way, I'm not sure I get these pronunciations all right, but I do have a program on my computer that tells me how I'm supposed to pronounce these words, okay? So hopefully I get them right, if I remember it, okay? So if I say them different from what you think, that's either I made a mistake or it's because that's what the program said. Cyrus, he's the one who conquered Babylon, as prophesied in Scripture, and eventually began then the return from captivity. Cambyses was the king of Persia who commanded that the work on the temple would stop. So Cyrus said they could go back. They went back. They started the book of Ezra, and that's one of my questions later on. You can learn a lot about the background from the book of Ezra, because God sent the people back to rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And Cyrus was providing them with materials and so on. This brought back much of the articles from the temple and so on, rebuilding the temple, but there was conflict with the people of the land, and so the later king, Cambyses, told him he had to quit. Darius, this is Darius the Great, then said they could start up again, so they did. Xerxes, also called Ahasuerus, was the husband of the king when Esther became queen. Then you have Artaxerxes. He was the king when Nehemiah led a group back. So these are some Persian kings that are significant, and I've got some dates there that, according to some of the archaeologists and so on. Okay, so that's some of the background of what we're talking about here. Questions, comments, discussion anybody has before we go further? Anybody? Sharon.
Just a short note that this Darius then would be very different from the Darius of Daniel.
Then Darius.
The Darius from the book of Daniel.
Yes.
Totally different.
Yes. Yeah, that's not unusual for kings to have the same name as other kings. We just had the death of Queen Elizabeth II. Okay. All right. So let's review our periods of Bible history. We've talked about this with regard to our prophets in the past. Okay. So we've divided history in the Bible into 15 periods. Most of the prophets that we have been reading from prophesied in either the divided kingdom, the period of Judah alone, the Babylonian captivity, or now the restoration from captivity. We're in this period here now, as the kings as the history has proceeded. And so we've talked about the prophets by period, remember. So many of our previous studies have been there during the period of the divided kingdom. Hosea and Amos preaching to the northern tribes primarily. Jonah, although he preached to Nineveh, was primarily a prophet from Israel. Those prophets to Judah during that period were Micah and some others. We didn't say Isaiah because that's a major prophet, but he was also a prophet during this period. But then the northern tribe fell, and now you've got just the nation of Judah. So we studied several prophets during that period, Zephaniah, Nahum, Habakkuk. We did not study Jeremiah because he's another major prophet. The period of Babylonian captivity, we have two prophets, but we didn't study them, Ezekiel and Daniel, because they are major prophets. But they prophesied during that period when the Jews were in captivity in Babylon. Now we're at the point of history where they're returning. Cyrus, the Persians overthrew the Babylonians. Cyrus is letting them go back. All this discussed in the book of Ezra and eventually Nehemiah. The prophets in this period are these three, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, beginning now with Haggai. Okay? Some background. I think it helps, especially in this book, because we're going to study about some of the problems that relate to some of these things. Other comments? Okay. Well, let me back up. What's the theme? What's the theme of the book of Haggai? What's it about? What's Haggai concerned with? Debbie.
Getting the temple rebuilt.
Okay. So as we talked about, the problem was they started to build the temple and they quit. and Haggai and Zechariah, but here Haggai, the prophets telling them, get back to work. Why aren't you building the temple? Now, as it says in verse 2, the Lord said, the people say the time has not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. So this is not the time for it. We won't do that now. When you read the book of Ezra, why did they quit, according to the book of Ezra? They started. Why did they quit, according to the book of Ezra? Debbie.
Because the local people made a fuss and told the king they were going to rebel.
Okay. So there were people already in the land who were not proper in their religion, and they were upset that the Jews had returned and were rebuilding the city, especially the temple. And so they tried to get him to quit. And you read the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, a lot of the problems that were caused for the people and when they returned by the people of the land. And in particular, some of the people wrote a letter to the king of Persia complaining and saying, these people are going to rebel. You let them build that temple, let them rebuild that city, and they're going to rebel against you, so you better do something about it. So we did. He said, okay, you got to quit. Make them quit. So they quit. Okay? Now we'll talk more about that as we go along, but that's the background. You see Haggai is speaking from God saying, that's not good enough. Yeah, you may have been told by a king, but there's reasons to keep going. We'll talk more about it as we go along. Other comments on the background and why they quit. And if you look at the chart just briefly, we have a short little book of 2 chapters, but it's fairly easily broken up into major points because there's 4 revelations that Haggai receives. The first one is this one, exhorting the people to complete the temple. The second one compares the temple as they rebuilt it to the temple that Solomon had built. The third one talks about how God would restore their blessings to them. And the fourth one, then he renews the promise to David's lineage, which ultimately, of course, would be fulfilled in the Christ. So that's basically an overview of what we're going to talk about. Questions or comments anybody has on that background and information? Okay? All right, see where we are. Okay, we want to answer question number 4. What were some other prophets or other people that are involved in this time period, whether mentioned in the book or not, but other involved in this time period that we're studying about? Who are some other people, other prophets and so on involved in this time period? Debbie?
Zechariah.
Zechariah was another prophet. And again, you read the scriptures that are listed there. Both of these men are prophesying during this period. Now we get to the book of Zechariah, we see it doesn't talk much about the rebuilding of the temple, but he prophesied during this time. What else? Any other people? Who else? Susie?
Wait, well, you already mentioned Ezra, but Zerubbabel and Joshua.
Ezra, we did mention, but you notice in verse 1, Haggai speaking mainly to Zerubbabel and to Joshua. Now, this is not the Joshua, the book of Joshua. We're much later than that. Joshua brought the people into the land to begin with after Moses. But this is a different Joshua. What is the relationship or the responsibility of Zerubbabel? Who is Zerubbabel?
Governor.
He's the governor. Now, we learn a lot about him also in the book of Ezra. But what do you know about Zerubbabel, other than the fact that he was the governor when they were trying to rebuild the land, the city and the temple? Anything else you know about Zerubbabel? There's at least one other very important point. Susie?
He was of the lineage of David.
All right. He's in the lineage of David, which tells you what? A lineage of David and ultimately an ancestor of Jesus. He's in Jesus' genealogy. Okay? Which means what about him? About Zerubbabel? Sharon?
Sure, if this is what you're looking for, but if these Jews had been independent, he would have been the king.
Okay. He has, by ancestry, by genealogy, he would have the right to be king. But he's not king, he's governor. Because all the lineage of the kings has been removed when they went into captivity, as prophesied by Jeremiah, that there would be no more descendants of the throne reigning in Jerusalem. Ultimately, Christ, a descendant of Zerubbabel, is king, deserved by lineage to become king, but he's not an earthly king. Not in Jerusalem, he's in heaven. Okay? Anything else you want to talk about before we quit? Anything else? Okay, thank you very much.